Hi, this is Silvia Gale, founder of Parting Thoughts. September is Suicide Awareness Month, and in the interest of calling attention to and shining some light on the ever increasing problem of self inflicted deaths and the aftermath of that loss, I've asked my friend Becky to join me today for a conversation on this topic, a topic she is sadly all too familiar with. I ask that you please use discretion as this conversation may not be suitable for all ages. Hi,
Eh,
Becky. Thanks for sitting down with me today and doing this recording. I have to be honest and say there's a part of me that's really a little bit of reserved right now. We want to bring awareness to the whole issue of suicide and suicide prevention, but I also know in doing that this could stir up a lot for you. And there's a part of me that wants to ask you a million questions, and there's a part of me that wants to protect you. But the reason that we've chosen to do this was to be able to remove that stigma of talking about it, right? So I'm just going to jump right in. On the afternoon of August 13th, 2016, your life was dramatically changed. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so sorry if I sound a little bit platonic as I'm talking about this, but I kind of, these events leading up to it, I've relived it in my head so many times that it just feels like facts now. So basically, what happened is Jake and I had been fighting. We had broken up about 2 weeks before this had happened, but we had agreed to meet that Saturday morning that I found him. So I was texting him, I was emailing him, I was talking with his family, asking, has anybody heard from him? Has anybody heard anything? Do you know what he's doing? Finally, his mom said, no, I haven't heard from him. Sorry, we've been at the zoo. I asked if I should go check on him. I did. At this point, it was about midnight, so I was just driving up late at night. I was actually out at a comedy show at the time, and I just left immediately. Um, I kind of knew in my gut what had happened, but I didn't want to admit it, I don't think, because I just told myself I was, worst case scenario.
Overthinking, overcautious. Yeah,
Absolutely. And you never want to believe that about somebody that you love. But also at the same time, you do know the person you love deeper than you think sometimes.
sure.
So it was scary. I mean, it was probably my rawest moment of my life in that I just kept listening to the same Motorhead song over and over and over again, trying to get myself amped up for whatever was going to happen
Right.
because I didn't know what I was walking into. But yeah, then
But
basically
your
I,
gut wasn't wrong.
right. And at the time, I had still had the keys, and I think he knew that. So I got there. I tried to open the door. It was chain locked. I looked in. He looked like he was just sitting there. But obviously, after looking at it and screaming his name probably 100 times, I kind of knew what had happened. So I called his mom immediately. She was like, basically reiterated the same thing that I did, said, call the police. Um, I called the police, then I called literally everybody I knew, all of his family members, and just kind of manically spiraled from there because you don't know how to process your emotions when something that traumatic happens. Um,
Yeah, I can't even imagine the trauma that you're feeling in that moment. Like every emotion has to be flooding your whole body and soul at that point in time. You have to feel scared and helpless and out of control.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember when the ambulance came to take him away, there was this kid who was across the street just harmlessly recording, just like an idiot college kid. And I started yelling at him, like, what the hell are you doing? I hope you die. Like, all of this awful stuff that I would never say in my logical
Otherwise,
mind.
sure.
But basically, I told him to fuck off. He didn't know, like, sorry for the language. I told him he didn't know what he was doing, that he was ruining my life, that all these things that he probably just
He was
went
your
home.
proxy for all those emotions that were building up inside of you.
Poor kid. Is all I can say. I really kind of let him have it from across the street. Um, yeah, so I was actually really fortunate that the police officer who showed up basically said, hey, you know what? I've never dealt with anything like this. I don't know what to do. He gave me a hug, said, I'm sorry. Do you just want some coffee? And that was the best response anybody could have given me in that situation.
And
Uh,
that's like all of us. None of us are trained for trauma,
right.
right? And we're just everyday people. We're not trained for trauma. And so the best thing that we can do is just be our human selves and just show a little bit of kindness and compassion in those
Absolutely.
moments. And he was so cool to do that and just say, hey, you want no coffee? And
He even asked me if he could hug me, which was very sweet. But
Above and beyond.
right, I think because I mean, especially when you're put into that situation too, and you don't know anybody in the situation, it can be equally as traumatic. Just
Sure.
because you don't know
Yeah.
how the people are going to react, you're being thrown into this situation
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
you don't know if it's going to be volatile or not. Luckily, it wasn't. But
So, what had Jake been like in the months before? Had you seen anything suspicious in his actions? Had he been withdrawing or struggling with sleep or saying things about potentially killing himself or not?
so at the time he was in law school, and we were kind of going through a rough patch in our relationship. I think he just kind of felt lost, but I didn't think it would be to that extent. I always thought that he was stronger than that just because of the things that he said, and he had always kind of been the rock in the relationship, and that like even if I was an emotional wreck, he would be the logical one.
Right.
And then at some point over the summer, that kind of flipped. Um, and I think we both kind of took it out on each other in that we didn't know what to do.
Do you think it was more circumstantial stresses with law school and a relationship and maybe other things in his life, or do you think it was more a product? Had there been some potential mental illness or instabilities that he had not quite worked out?
I think, to be honest, for him, he had always been driven to a fault. And while I like to reiterate that he was never diagnosed with this, but he showed all the classic signs of bipolar and that he would be manic.
Okay.
I mean, the fact that he got a full ride to law school, that he learned German in 2 years, like that shows definite manic signs, and then he would just withdraw.
So this
Um,
is a part of the awareness is that there's a lot of people who go undiagnosed because they have never seen themselves through that lens,
right.
and that's where it's important for those around to try and have some input when we see these kind of things. But there's also a balance in that the person also has to recognize what's going on in their own life too and be responsible themselves.
Right. And it from my perspective it just looked like tortured genius almost. And I think that's kind of the common trope that was before, but now we're starting to realize, oh, there's actually a chemical reason for this in the brain, or oh, we can actually make that a little better for the person who's suffering from it.
Right.
Um,
But his actions clearly left you in a messed up state, to put it bluntly,
yep.
right?
And I try to keep that as open as possible just because I feel like a lot of people do go through that kind of thing no matter what the loss, whatever the catalyst of the loss was.
Absolutely.
So basically, I just used alcohol and my car were my two coping mechanisms, which is unfortunate, but I mean, that's where my brain was. I don't know how else I would have dealt with it, and luckily I was able to get out of it on the other side.
When Cheryl Strayed, the author of Wild, lost her mother, I know her therapy was to hit the road, actually hit the hiking trail, and she hiked the whole Pacific Coast Trail. You hit the road also, just in a different way.
I wish mine was spiritual like that. Unfortunately, it was just following the same band over and over and over again, just because it was the last major band that we had saw in the city, and we had said, oh, we're definitely going to see them again. They're great. They're up and coming, that kind of thing. So mine was basically just reliving one of the last positive memories I had with him. And in the process, probably freaking the band out quite a bit.
You had a practice that you did at every concert, and that was to buy two tickets. What was the point of doing that?
I think that was
You can
honest.
only use one.
Right. Yeah, and some of the bouncers were like, "Are you sure? You seem lonely. Did somebody ditch you?" That kind of thing. Um, but it was basically just extending that legacy. So it felt like he was still there with me. I mean, the purpose of it was to try to see that concert again with him because music was such an important thing in our lives. Even like when I think I mentioned in the book as well, like we'd be fighting, we'd be at each other's throats, like piercing eyes, and then all of a sudden we'd go to a concert and it'd be cool. Um, so it was just reliving that.
Admittedly, while you were following these concerts, these road concerts, you had kind of gotten in a spiral, a downward spiral of some heavy drinking and smoking and things that weren't necessarily good for you. But you pulled yourself out of it, and what could have became a life pattern didn't. So what do you think led to that? How did that come about for you?
Admittedly, at first it was financial, just because I had been on the road for on and off for about a year, and I'd spent a lot of money recklessly, as one does when they aren't mentally there. So I basically it was me just looking at my finances and saying, okay, what do I need to survive? Oh, alcohol, I don't need that to survive, so it's out. A second thing was just thinking about how those around me who I care about, like how would this impact them? While you should always lean on the people that you care about, and to a point, you never want to become reliant on them. You still want to have your
Right,
own footing.
right,
And I couldn't see myself continuing to drink like this without eventually becoming reliant on somebody.
right. We're responsible for our own selves, but every decision that we make also impacts everyone around us who
Right.
love and care for us.
And my mom's already been through enough. I don't want her to be a mom forever, right? Like she deserves to retire from that role. So, while that's a minor part, I mean, it was part of my decision process and cutting back and just learning to take my life back again.
That's great. That's great that you could do that and you kind of saw that pattern happening. And if nothing else, by default of your wallet,
Right.
you were able to make a decision for the better. Um, so you had been traveling to several different cities, and while you were on the road, you had obviously a lot of people around you at these concerts, but you were really isolated and never shared your story with anyone about Jake's death until one day you got into a Uber or Lyft, and you had a female driver who was a little rough around the edges, and that was the day that you chose to share your story. What made you pick her?
To be honest, it was mostly because she was so very much honest about herself right from the get go. I mean, she had hearty seats, confidently smoking in a place you definitely shouldn't be smoking. And I could tell she did not give two craps about me at first. Like, she did not, she wore herself on her sleeve. And I think it was partly I just needed to release it out
Yeah,
to
you didn't
somebody.
need to give two craps about her either.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it was a mutual thing.
Right. And for some reason that brought us together closer is when we both realized like this person's not going to give two shits about me if I say something. And from what she told me about her relationship too, it kind of felt like the same. So we basically just used each other for vessels for I needed to say something, she needed to say something, we just kind of let it hang. And that kind of opened the floodgate for me in that, oh, well, sometimes people do just want to hear what's in your head and it
Right,
won't freak them out.
right. So sometimes in the not caring, we can share the deepest. And so this was that point for you where you started sharing the story about what you had been through and your experiences rather than trying to isolate and handle them all on your own. And then farther down in your travels down the road, you encountered another two or three people who allowed you to do that once again. Can you tell me a bit about them?
They were great. I hope to someday meet them again. But basically, what happened is we were at the concert. They were older. I could tell that they were kind of my speed in that we were just talking about traveling, and she was talking about tips and tricks on how to financially be able to keep continuing to travel. And we ended up going to a dive bar next door. It was one that I already planned on going to anyway, so I thought, great. And their friend, their crazy friend, was trying to hook me up with literally anybody in the bar because she really was just living vicariously through me. And I made it very clear that I didn't want that to happen, and then I said why. And I kind of just dropped the bomb. And then she said, I've been through something similar. My brother committed suicide as well.
Wow.
So, again, that was another one of those experiences where we were both just staring down at the bar, not looking at each other, just telling each other, telling our stories, basically. And again, it was just that the other person is a vessel for healing. I think I was the same for her in that we were listening to what the other person was saying, but there were so many things that we both needed to say. And
There's
that
those
was,
moments in life that we cross paths with someone that is just no accident.
right,
However you want to define it, whether it's a spiritual thing or whether it's just a universe thing or nature taking its course, somehow we seem to find that path and connect on that path. And you had such a deep moment with her, even though she was a complete stranger.
right. And I think part of that was just almost one of those things when you first meet somebody, you realize that you're on the same level with them and you can't really tell why.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was because of that shared experience.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I can't say for certain, but we just had very similar dispositions, and I think that might have been the
And
catalyst.
connection.
Yeah.
So this had been how far into um, the year of his passing?
So this would have been about 6 or 7 months after, I believe. I'd have to look at a calendar, but so
So
this was in
did it
June.
feel like you were progressing, Becky, from your loss? Like you were starting to work through it? Or, I mean, I can look at your story and see where you weren't talking about it at all, and then you kind of blurted it out to the first person who you were comfortable enough to do that with.
Right.
And then you kind of met other people along the way who you could share that same story and connection. And there was a progress that was happening, but did you feel that at all?
To be honest, it just felt like jumps. So I would feel like at one point I would just jump, and I wasn't really sure if I went anywhere, whether it was just up and down or if I went, you know, sideways. I couldn't really tell at that point because I was just testing the waters and what I was comfortable with.
Right. But eventually you have to get off the road too,
Yep.
unless you're independently wealthy. And
Right. And I
I
still
don't
am
know a lot of
not,
people in Milwaukee who who fit that
right?
that boat, who can just travel indefinitely. And so eventually you had to come home. And was that a time of really getting to the nitty gritty and starting to deal with your grief and emotions? And
It was scary. Yeah, because I think for a while I had
because our tendency is to fight or flight, right?
Right,
And you chose flight,
right.
and as most of us do in
Hmm.
these types of situations. And so, um, now the rubber was starting to meet the road, though, and you had to come home.
Right.
What happens then?
It was rough. I mean, I had cast this like wanderlust whatever to everybody who had asked. And then when they finally saw me, I think they saw how much weight I had lost and how I just wasn't 100% there. I was getting there definitely, but when you come back, when you're back in the world again, especially since Jake and I both lived in Milwaukee, so there's so many memories here. Um, it was a process. It was an adjusting process. It was kind of like you return to your house and all of a sudden your favorite couch is missing or something like that. It's the
Right.
same place, but something's not an
So
integrable
different.
part is not there. Um,
And you're never getting that couch back. You're never
right,
getting that space back that was so comfortable for you before. So
right,
there's one of two options. You're either going to sit in that uncomfortable space and allow that grief to consume your life, or you're going to move forward. And you clearly chose to move forward. And I think that your path was to write your book. Can you tell us a little bit about how that all came about?
yeah. So basically, I just had a bunch of energy still since I had come back. I've always been a writer. Writer's always been my outlet. And I had always said, oh, I'm going to write a book. And Jake would always be like, yeah, okay, you haven't written one yet. You're not starting to write one. You're never going to write one. Just because that's kind of how we checked each other. That wasn't like a mean thing. It was just how we kept each other on track. But I thought I would really like something, or when I was going through this, I would have really liked something like this, where somebody would just tell their honest story and just let it out into the world, hopefully for somebody else to relate to.
Absolutely. I try and remind everyone that I'm working with through the Parting Thoughts group about the importance of sharing our story. We live our story. We have to own our story. And stories are meant to be told. That's why there's so many books out there. That's why there's so many speakers out there.
Right.
And that's what brings us connection. And so it's important to be able to share our stories in whatever medium is comfortable for each individual person. And that book was clearly your comfort zone. This road must go somewhere
And
is
if
the
you can,
title of your book, and other things I told
you
myself.
can read my handwriting. That is excellent.
And and so where did the road take you now?
To be honest, I'm still trying to figure out. I always think that the path is never 100% done. And it's always kind of a battle, always. I mean, I still have dreams about Jake where I wake up and I'm kind of disoriented. It's not always traumatic. Sometimes it's just, in the dream, we're just driving through Merton, Wisconsin, just trying to find this metal sculpture garden that's out there.
Right.
That hurts just as much knowing that it's not there. So it's constantly learning, like, well, in the moment, what can I do to make this better? And I've learned that you can't repress it, even if you feel you don't have the time. You need to make the time to make sure you're okay.
Hmm.
And I think that's been the biggest learning thing for me this year is just making sure that I'm being mindful of where I am at mentally, literally at all times. Just constantly checking myself, whether it's journaling or just doing a mental checkup.
That's great. That's so healthy. Just to to check in with yourself, like you said, and just the mindfulness
Right.
that will help us to keep ourselves together and move forward. You also did a second book called Moving Forward. So what's captured in that moment?
Basically, so the story of moving forward is I wrote my first book, and literally everybody who wrote it said, you're not done. Like, I am still very worried about you. You need to write a second book. So at first I was like, fine, I'll write a second book, whatever. Like, I'll do this for you guys. And then as I started writing it, I realized how much further I've gone in my mental journey. And I really wanted to capture that because as I said, it is a constant journey.
Right.
There's never any final endpoint. So this is where I went after I was on the road.
So having read the first book is really raw and really vulnerable, and and maybe triggering for some who read it. Um, but there's a progression that happens there, and moving forward is a lesser degree of raw, and you can tell the healing. I hate to use that word sometimes because healing just implies full recovery to me. And I don't believe that we ever fully recover from the loss of our loved ones. But for lack of a better word, I will use that.
Thank you.
And you are farther down the road in your healing and progression. And so this experience of that was beyond your control, you were so affected by someone else's actions. What's the best way that we can draw some awareness to this and hopefully no one else would have to ever deal with this kind of thing? We know it's bound to happen. People are going to. But what can we draw from this moment, from your experience?
Uh, I would say don't be scared to tell your story. It sounds cheesy. It sounds really, really cheesy, but I think a lot of the things that I did manically at least were because I was just so scared that everybody would reject my story or not care or something like that. It's just constantly being mindful of where you're at, checking in with yourself, making sure you're being honest with yourself and with others. And I
Yeah,
think that just makes you're able to better assess the world outside of you if mentally inside you're present.
right. We have to we have to be present before we can go forward, before we can't get to future without being present first.
Right.
So thank you so much for sharing this. I kind of wish that those who are listening could actually see your face. We've both had moments where we've teared up and felt the impact of this, but we really wanted to share this story, and so I so appreciate your willingness to once again get really raw and share um, all of your experiences, and hopefully this will be a help to someone else who's maybe facing the same thing or maybe can even avoid that thing. So thank
Absolutely.
you. So Becky has written two books again. Her first, This Road Must Go Somewhere, and Other Things I Told Myself, and followed up by Moving Forward.
And you can buy those either via my site, which is beckysquestforreason.com, or you can go on Amazon.
Love it. Becky's Quest for Reason.
Right. And
Isn't that all of us?
right. One day, one day, one day, one day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Becky.
Thanks for having me.